We're going to talk today about how building reuse is actually climate action and why we must really urgently change the culture of the construction and green building and real estate industries to embrace that. Let's start from a very wide angle. And if we look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which were put in place in order to make the world a better place, and if we look at number 11, which is sustainable cities and communities. Well, why are we looking at cities when we're here to talk about buildings? The reason is cities occupy just 3% of the Earth's land, but they produce 60 to 80% of our energy consumption and 75% of our carbon emissions. Furthermore, if we look at global carbon emissions, that's from the entire world, we see in this pie chart from Architecture 2030 that the building operations, or what we call operational carbon, it represents 28% of global carbon emissions, and building materials and construction, which we call embodied carbon, is 11%, together making 39%. A lot of the global carbon emissions comes from buildings, but it's actually worse than that. If we look at a typical North American city of, say, 1 million people, we have actual carbon emissions from buildings that derive 63% of the total carbon emissions in that city. So the bigger the city, the higher the percentage of carbon emissions come from buildings. New York City, for example, is 70%. So in typical cities across the continent, we know we've got a lot of carbon from buildings, and we also know this. If we look historically at the data of cities and their emissions from 2005 to 2019, this one typical city really doesn't make any gains in those 14 years. 2005 is a pretty good marker to start because it's when there was sort of mainstream awareness that we had to make some changes and municipal policy started coming in. And there has been some headway because we've made more and more carbon by building more and more. And we've managed to keep it roughly the same. But in 10 years, we need to have this. We need to cut it down in half. So we need massive change, and we need it now. And if we look at the world, we know that 80% of people live in urbanized settings. So the urban world is a place where there are buildings everywhere and change is constant. So the fact that cities change is not a problem. Cities are organic, they're going to grow, they're going to evolve, they're going to adapt, and that's good. But what we want to do is change what we're changing. So we need a sea change of change. And it's that type of change that I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about. Instead of demolishing every building as soon as it doesn't feel like it has value anymore, when it actually does, and building new, why don't we reuse those buildings and save a lot of embodied carbon? So let's recap for a second. The stakes are really high. Decarbonization is urgent. The impacts on human, financial, natural, and cultural assets massive. We've got about a decade only. Existing buildings are about 1/3 to 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. Really, from my perspective, there's really only one good solution in combating climate change, and that is the extreme acceleration of green rehab of existing and historic buildings. And in fact, looked at from another way, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who's really the world authority on this topic, have told us that improving energy efficiency in existing buildings encompasses the most diverse, largest, and most cost-effective mitigation opportunities to combat climate change. Great, but they told us that in 2012. So what have we done since? Well, not a lot, and it puts a lot of pressure on moving quickly to really have a paradigm shift in the industries that deal with buildings in any way. In fact, so much so that I think we need to apply a new principle. Most of you have heard about the KISS principle, which stands for Keep It Simple, Stupid. Well, In this case, I'd like to invoke the ITEBS principle. It's the existing buildings stupid. That's really where we need to refocus, and very much so to the extent that we need to decarbonize our special places. We need to decarbonize our ordinary places. We need to decarbonize Main Street. We need to decarbonize your street. So now that we've brought it down to your street and the fact that it's every building, it's not just the mountain of big buildings downtown, it's also the carpet of buildings around the peripheries of cities that are lower scale, mostly residential. So let's look at this story about the evolution of a residential building as an example. Here in 1866 was built a nice family home, and you're seeing it from the street through the gate. You're seeing some elements. There's the element highlighted in purple, that sort of vertical pointy top element. There's a sort of very special window highlighted in yellow and an entry in green. Well, as the story evolves, as the house evolves, about 4 decades in, we see a pretty nice renovation, a major renovation. They still have the pointy top vertical element and the very special window and the lovely entry that you see in those highlighted colors. But it wasn't about carbon then, it was about style, and the owners decided they wanted it in a new style, a new way. Fast forward again another 40 years, or more like 45 years, and we're seeing really what I would call, rather than a renovation, more like a functional upgrade. The new owners wanted something more formal and restrained. They didn't follow as much the 3 character elements, but they did keep a single family, but they started adding additional extra functions. Now, the evolution of a building often includes a sort of ongoing history. In the case of this particular home, the evolution garnered some fine features over the years. There's this lovely stone carved architrave around the front door. There's this fine staircase off the main hall. So a building gathers value over time, economic, social, environmental value with embodied carbon, and certainly cultural value as you see these character defining features. Not only that, but this particular building is in a nice neighborhood. These are modeled images of the view to the home from the street on the top image, and a view to the home from the river, because the property that the house sits on actually backs onto the river. So we have a really lovely setup here. So if we have all that, why are recently people screaming in a hue and a cry for demolishing the building? Okay, yes, it hasn't had its proper maintenance upkeep for the last couple of decades. It does have leaky windows and out-of-date systems. And yes, people are saying we can do better with a new building, but really there's a lot of value in there. And to keep our carbon down, what we proposed is preservation and rehabilitation to net zero and adding the contemporary upgrades layer. So another change to the house, just like it's had in evolution, a new set or layer of contemporary needs of the day. And of course, in this case, there's the 3 features that we saw in the early days of the house, but expressed in a new way again. And rehabbing to net zero. So we're saving all of that embodied energy. What are we doing with all the new pressures and mounting of pressures of the new needs and the new requirements of the home? Well, we've been able to take those out and put them in an addition so that the home itself, the historic home itself, can really serve the function that it was originally intended to do. It's a single family home. And all of the new additional pressures, or shall we say programmatic elements that need to be accomplished in the house, can still be accomplished with a very compatible secondary building on the site. Well, surprise, the building is actually 24 Sussex Drive, residence of Canada's Prime Minister. And here you see a floor plan of the ground floor showing the historic home on the right and the proposed new addition on the left. But really, the solution, instead of just demolishing the building, we want to reuse it, decarbonize it, and build better for today. And in order to do that for 24 Sussex Drive, this proposal takes 24 conservation strategies for the preservation and update rehabilitation of the historic building, and the upgrade to net zero for that building is part of 24 sustainability strategies for the whole site. In this case, the new building, the existing building, and the site itself all contribute different factors to bring us a high level of sustainability. In fact, the new building being carbon positive, where in effect it's like adding back into the carbon grid instead of the energy grid. And it can become a demonstration, a new wing that demonstrates Canadian prowess, Canadian technologies, et cetera, for green, sustainable growth. And the existing building, now rehabbed back to a family home, but at net zero carbon. People love the juxtaposition of new and old. They love it when older things, older buildings especially, are brought back to life and new uses, new elements are brought to the fore. For example, Canada's first railway tunnel in Brockville, built in 1860, shuttered for decades, becoming just a liability, now has been transformed back into an asset, something that people love to visit and go to this place for, with a new soundtrack and kinetic lighting system. It's really a wonder to walk through. Another example is the Distillery District in Toronto. The inset that you see on the left side of your screen there is how it looked in the 1800s. It's really a carbon belching industrial zone on the edge of downtown. Downtown grew around it. It really became something for, as time marched on, it became something that was not desirable. It was shut down. Well, it was then reimagined in 2003 so that we have new uses for existing buildings. There's less carbon being used than if we had knocked them down and built new. And it's really lovely for new uses. There you can see, for example, a yoga session happening in one of the courtyards. The bottom line is we need to find a way to disrupt the design and building sectors, the construction industry, real estate, all the industries involving existing buildings, and have them embark on new collaborative change that addresses the decarbonization of most existing buildings, puts a new focus, if you will, in the industry. And really, if we can do this with the Empire State Building, which is a very complex building, almost 100 years old, it's a very challenging deep carbon retrofit and rehabilitation that has been very successful, then we can do it really on any building. And we have to focus on 2 years. We need to be decarbonized to 50% by 2030, that's only a decade, and fully decarbonized by 2050, 3 decades from now, to keep the Earth below a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase. We really need to be becoming proficient and poetic about the transformation and deep carbon rehab of existing buildings. That's going to be the next cool. And we'll see an avalanche of this post-COVID-19 over the next decade. Like household recycling and car sharing, we can reuse and recycle and reimagine our massive stock of buildings. Let's put our creative energies into developing the technologies and design for this now. Decarbonize existing buildings using new green power such as solar and wind, and really make this work, change the industry. As Daniel Zarillo, the Chief Sustainability Officer for New York City, says, now is the time to put up or shut up. Climate change is here now. To that, I would only add ITEBs. It's the existing building, stupid. Thank you very much.